All right, welcome and good afternoon, everybody. My name is Keith Carlson, and I'm the director of the Peace and Reconciliation Center. I'm very happy to host today's Peace Talk, Genocides Across Time and Space. Today, I am coming to you from Chilhowyack territory. I'm in Chilliwack, and I think one of the things that we're able to do, we have a panel of historians here today, is that we're all in a position where we're able to direct our research towards helping correct and rectify the wrongs that have been done throughout time in the past, and to bring truth-telling to that important process of truth and reconciliation building. I'm very pleased today to have with me Professor Stephen Schroeder. Stephen is the director of the university's Peace and Conflict Studies program, and he's also one of the commitment leaders here at the Peace and Reconciliation Center, where he oversees a community of practice that works on trauma and harm reduction. I think importantly, he's here today because of the scholarship that he's done in the past around in German history and Holocaust history. And I encourage people to take a look at his book, To Forget It All and Begin Anew, Reconciliation in Occupied Germany, 1944 to 1945. After Steve speaks, we'll move to Professor Dr. Larissa Horne, sorry. She is the coordinator of the experiential education program here on campus and also an instructor in the history department who specializes in Russian and Soviet history. And she will be talking about the Stalinist purges and the genocides that occurred in the Soviet era. Following that, we have Dr. Sebastian Huebel. I'm not sure how you pronounce that. I should have asked you much earlier, Steve.
Huebel.
Huebel, thank you. Sebastian Huebel is an instructor working for us and an incredibly popular teacher on campus, as students will tell you, and has published the book recently, Fighter, Worker, and Family Man, German Jewish Men and the Gendered Experience in Nazi Germany, 1933 to 1941. Now, just before we start, and I pass things over to Steve, I thought I would just start by letting everybody know sort of the context of this. This talk today has grown out of some activities that the university has hosted in the past little while. Last week, Dr. Schroeder has hosted a symposium where we brought in and showed a screen to film, Love in the Age of Fentanyl, which was looking at the work of the safe injection sites and the incredible work that's being done there and how that work is and the philosophy is expanding. He and Seb also participated a day earlier last week in a peace talk that the university hosted, Peace and Reconciliation and the History Department, where we brought in Alex Buckman, one of the few remaining survivors of the Nazi Holocaust in Germany in the 1940s. And so this conversation today is meant to grow out of those and to help us move forward. The United Nations definition of genocide, which of course grew immediately following the Holocaust and has defined the discussions, defines it according to several criteria, which have been the point of lots of discussion within Canada and around the world as different people who examine colonization, discrimination, atrocities, war crimes, and others have looked to see whether or not certain activities do or do not meet the definition of genocide. And I think that also raises important questions about what happens if they come close but don't, or in the past they were different criteria. And so I encourage people to look at that. But the definition the UN provides are killing members of a particular group. And of course, we know that typically the groups that are targeted are ethnic, national, or racial groups. But across time and space, as we'll be talking about today, there were also gendered groups defined by their sexuality, and sometimes groups that were targeted because they were members of a particular economic class. The second criteria that the UN identifies is causing serious bodily or mental harm to members of a group. The third is deliberately inflicting upon the group conditions of life that are calculated to bring about its physical destruction in whole or in part. The fourth is imposing measures intended to prevent births within that group. And the final one is forcibly transferring the children of a group over to another group. And as you'll see, the discussions today deal with all or some of those categories in every instance. Thank you very much, and I'm now going to pass this over to Professor Schroeder.
Thanks so much, Keith, and thanks for that definition of genocide that was really, engendered by Raphael Lemkin at the end of the war, close to the end of the war. And it's much broader than I think a lot of our conversations go to, right? We usually think of kind of the more obvious cases of mass killing, and there are many more things that are included in that that are often overlooked. It's so great to be here with you all and to discuss this important topic, and be with my colleagues and to look at genocides across time and space. And it's my task to address the Holocaust and see how it fits into the broader phenomenon of genocide, and to share my analysis and provide some commentary as to the everyday aspects of the Holocaust, which perhaps alarmingly are many. So genocide is part of human history, and tragically has been rather common over the centuries. Because of this fact, it can be seen as somewhat normal in human history, which is troubling to think about. But of course, we know that normal is not necessarily good. In this case, obviously, it's the opposite. And the international community and organizations and individuals, of course, have opposed genocidal thought and actions, and including to the point of collective security and using armed force to stop it. So turning specifically to the Holocaust, we might ask, what are the normal human aspects of this genocide? Weren't the Nazis, chief among them Adolf Hitler, madmen? Can we see ourselves in the thoughts and actions of Nazi leaders and their accomplices? What about everyday German people and many other Europeans who participated in the genocide? How do we explain that? So in response to these and other related questions, I'll address 3 main points, and really look at some of the preconditions to the Holocaust, and then move on to familiar motivators and ordinary people, and then look at extraordinary acts in the immediate context. So I noticed, even in preparing this is calling it extraordinary is kind of going back on what I was just saying about normal, but in the immediate context, of course, it's extraordinary activity. But in the broader context of human history, we see these things happening over and over again. I'm going to share my slides right now. So I've just got a few of them here. And okay, so this is the observing tower, a shot I took from the observing tower at Birkenau, which is where all of the mass killings with use of Zyklon B took place. And this is the infamous sorting ramp there that was used. So the preconditions that I want to point to, there are many, and we'll just touch on a few here. One thing that I think is very important is understanding anti-Judaism and anti-Semitism. Anti-Judaism is a religious argument against the Jewish people based largely on their religion. And this really began in the 1st century. And the first Christians were actually mostly Jews. And then there became a schism there, right, when Christianity was formed. And when some Jews did accept Jesus as the prophesied Messiah, and others did not, right? And so Christians, the Christianity, which became the dominant religion of Europe, used these accusations against the Jews on a religious basis, but it was also then a personal kind of basis, that Jews were blind, Jews were obstinate, Jews were other. And it was Martin Luther in 1543 who wrote on the Jews and their lives. I'm just going to read a couple things out today during my time here, because I think it's just really important to hear it straight out, just a few excerpts. So Martin Luther wrote, "What shall we Christians do with this rejected and condemned people, the Jews? Since they live among us, we dare not tolerate their conduct. Now that we are aware of their lying and reviling and blasphemy, if we do, we become sharers in their lies, cursing and blasphemy. Thus we cannot extinguish the unquenchable fire of divine wrath. Thus we cannot, of which the prophets speak, nor can we convert the Jews. With prayer and the fear of God, we must practice a sharp mercy, to see whether we might save at least a few of them from the glowing flames. We dare not avenge ourselves. Vengeance 1,000 times worse than we could wish them already has them by the throat. I shall give you my sincere advice. So here's Martin Luther's advice. First, set fire to their synagogues and schools and bury and cover them with dirt, whatever will not burn, so that no man will ever again see a stone or cinder of them. This is to be done in honor of our Lord and of Christendom, so that God might see that we are Christians. And do not condone or knowingly tolerate such public lying, cursing, and blaspheming in his Son, of his Son, and of Christians. So that's number one. Number two is destroy their homes. Number three is destroy their prayer books in the Talmud. Number four is do not let rabbis teach. Number five is do not allow for safe travel on highways. 6, do not allow them to borrow money. 7, forced labor. And 8, we must drive them out like mad dogs from our country. And the very conclusion says, God has struck the Jews with madness and blindness and confusion of mind, end quote. So we are even at fault in not avenging all this innocent blood of our Lord and of Christians, which they shed for 300 years after the destruction of Jerusalem, and the blood of the children they have shed since then. We are at fault in not slaying them. So why do I share that with you? This is, we're looking at common understandings, and this is not just Germany, of course. It's across Europe and elsewhere, but this type of teaching from a lot of the church fathers and during the Reformation was common. So we're looking for common threads that go through. Did this cause the Holocaust? No. Is it a precursor that feeds into it? I would say absolutely. So then moving forward, you can see some of those social Darwinism. You can think about how that would play into precursors, eugenics, all of these racial categorizing of people. That's a major thing in genocide. And the term anti-Semitism was really coined by Wilhelm Marr in 1879. So it's a late 19th century word, really. And it was to capture the phenomenon of seeing the Jews as other and as objects of disdain apart from religion. So this is more of a quote unquote scientific argument that they were of a different race, a lesser than being culturally, racially, whatever. And then, of course, there's mass death of some of the precursors, including genocides in Africa, which Seb will speak to, and the First World War, this generation running the Holocaust, you know, if you could speak of it that way. These people are largely familiar with mass death, mass war, and genocides, right? This is part of their context. So then moving to familiar things that motivate people, we find that a lot of the motivation for people involved in the Nazi regime, and then specifically in the Holocaust, were very simple things. And from a lot of the interviews we have, we don't have a lot of them, but of perpetrators and camp commanders, some mention the Jews, some are openly anti-Semitic, but many are not. And you could say, well, they're trying to cover their tracks, but yeah, the more I've read through this stuff, it seems like they're just speaking their lives, and what's really important to them is what's important to everyday people, which is moving ahead in life, getting more money, maybe more possessions, power. And we can look at a lot of individual massacres throughout Europe, and also the large-scale campaigns that would reflect all of these. There's many, if you want to look into Jan Gross's book, Neighbors in Poland, where one half of the town turned on the other half, really for their stuff, right? They could take all their stuff. Things like that, right? And so already in 1933, when Adolf Hitler took power, there's some laws against everyday people for their loyalty, for their social orientation, for their sexual orientation, so on. But the boycott of Jewish stores in April is an important one, that where the Nazis tested it out. A lot of people didn't really care about it because they're more interested in their everyday lives and shopping where they wish, which is also an indicator of public buy-in 1933 for a supposed campaign against the Jews. And the restoration, notice the word of restoration of the professional civil service. What is it being restored to? How has it become, defiled in some way? Because those are not all 100% quote unquote Aryan Germans, right? So then let's look at the left column. So if you want a job in the civil service and there's no way you're going to get one, or you're going to be at the bottom of the seniority list, and these people are just kind of, shoved out of their jobs, that makes room for you. And it could be that simple. I want that job, that's great. I don't really care who was here before, right? So a lot of these things we see throughout the Holocaust as well. How about some ordinary people in the camps? Here we see pictures of two men, Karl Fritsch and Oskar Gröning. Karl Fritsch on the left, he had, there's nothing remarkable about his life, except he's a deputy to Rudolf Höss at Auschwitz. And when Höss was on a business trip, I guess you'd call it, he was literally going to other camps to find out how to best dispose of human remains, as grotesque as that is. That was his business trip. Fritsch started gassing Soviet POWs at Auschwitz. He didn't ask for permission or anything. In fact, this is kind of a career move, right? It's like, well, my boss will be happy, and he was. We do have a record of Höss in his autobiography as saying he was very relieved they didn't have to use other methods. So Fritsch, that's a career move, basically, right? What about Oskar Gröning? Gröning, here's a picture of him in 2015. Gröning was a functionary at Auschwitz. And Gröning, again, a totally ordinary guy. And he had very conservative parents. And they considered the First World War to be, of course, a tragedy in Germany. The interwar period was a disaster financially, especially after 29 and the stock crash. And Gröning thought the Nazis were the best way forward. Getting a dry throat here. And so he supported the Nazis, and he joined the SS, and then went to Auschwitz to work. And so his benefits were broad. He didn't have to go to the front. He got to eat well. He got great sleeping conditions. And there's much made of the best bar in Europe was at Auschwitz, right? Because people brought alcohol from all over Europe to the camp. And he made money by stealing it. Gröning admitted to stealing some money and buying a weapon while in the camp. And then when the laws changed in the 21st century and in Germany, Gröning actually became part of a campaign to find people who were accomplices to mass murder. And then he was deemed guilty and stood trial. But he died just three years after this in hospital. Another very ordinary guy, they called him Babyface. This is Franz Ziereis. He was the commander of the Mauthausen camp in Austria. He was, again, very ordinary guy, and he was, by the people who worked with him and knew him very well, they recognized that he did not have outstanding skills. In fact, James Waller writes in his book called Becoming Evil, Ziereis's personal military history does not show that he possessed any particularly outstanding leadership skills or abilities, nor did he have an above average intelligence. He was himself, saw his rapid career advancement as a payoff from Heinrich Himmler, head of the SS, for agreeing to remain as camp commander rather than being transferred to the front lines again. Those who knew him spoke of him as a model husband and devoted father. In short, he was ordinary as ordinary gets, with one singular exception, his seemingly boundless capacity for brutality. This reality is unsettling because it counters our general mental tendency to relate extraordinary acts to correspondingly extraordinary people. But we cannot evade this discomforting reality. We are forced to confront the ordinariness of most perpetrators of genocide and mass killing. And that's, again, James Waller from his book, Becoming Evil. The third point is this shift from ordinary to extraordinary. And we have what's been called the Holocaust by bullets. It took place in 1941 when the death squads, the Einsatzgruppen, followed the German army into Soviet-held territories. To put it short and bluntly, it was onerous for the Germans to send their best young men into these these killing squads. And so the SS leadership decided to come up with more efficient methods. Again, this is a problem-solving method, pardon me. And so they met at this house in Wannsee, just outside Berlin. And these are primary documents, the map and the calculations of Jews living in Europe. You can see 11 million on the bottom right corner there. These are the crass calculations of the Nazis and a map as to where all of the Jews in Europe lived. And so it's here that Operation Reinhard, named after Reinhard Heydrich, who was heading the meeting, came into force. And this is a familiar picture, the horrific picture, again, of Birkenau with a sorting ramp. And you can see there on the left, the 6 killing centers at Helmno, Treblinka, Sobibor, Majdanek, Belzec, and Auschwitz. And it's in this context where we dig back to the last point I was making, where the death squads went into Poland to kill commissars. It's the Kommissarbefehl. It was to target out communists and their accomplices. But these squads started killing Jewish people. And it was Himmler who went to Hitler and said, what do we do with this? And Hitler said, okay, we can allow this to happen. It actually serves our purposes in some way, but just make sure you call them partisans. They had to give a reason for it. You can kill Jews as partisans. So you notice there isn't this grand plan, but there's a general movement towards, the persecution of Jews. And then the question is what to do with them and others who were unwanted by the Nazis. And these things fleshed out really in everyday experiences and along the way. All right, to conclude here, I just wanted to point to a couple things. One, morality, and then this haunting message from Christopher Browning. In Claudia Kuntz's book, she wrote a book called The Nazi Conscience. And she wrote, quote, although Jews had been fellow citizens before 1933, by the time Germany invaded Poland in 1939, they no longer belonged to Germans' universe of moral obligation. This transformation did not just happen. The expulsion of Jews from the Germans' universe of moral obligation was carefully engineered. And she looks at the processes, how that happened in those first 6 years of Nazi rule. And this book by Christopher Browning, Ordinary Men, Reserve Police Battalion 101 and the Final Solution, you can see in Poland, you can see that the picture of the group there. They were one of these death squads who went throughout Europe, Poland, and they killed thousands of Jewish civilians. And he says in the conclusion of his book, and I'll leave it here, the collective behavior of the reserve battalion has deeply disturbing implications. There are many societies afflicted by traditions of racism and caught in the siege mentality of war or threat of war. Everywhere society conditions people to respect and defer to authority, and indeed could scarcely function otherwise. Everywhere people seek career advancement. In every modern society, the complexity of life and the resulting bureaucratization and specialization attenuate the sense of personal responsibility of those implementing official policy. Within virtually every social collective, the peer group exerts tremendous pressures on behavior and sets moral norms. If the men of Reserve Police Battalion 101 could become killers under such circumstances, what group of men cannot? That's a haunting question for us all. I'll just leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen. I'll get you to stop sharing your screen now, and we'll switch it over to Larissa.
Thank you. Thank you very much. The topic I'm covering today is the state-sponsored terror in Stalinist Russia, including the Great Terror that happened in 1937-1938. On July 30th, 1937, the police chief of the USSR sent a secret order to all regions in the country stating that 250,000 people, 250,000 people had to be executed or exiled. The order was to affect victims from all layers of society. The Great Terror that ensued became an unprecedented event in Soviet history, but as we will learn today, genocides and terrors are not that unprecedented in human history. During the Great Terror, 1.7 million people were arrested and 1.5 million people convicted, including 740,000 sentenced to death. And numbers vary. Soviet historian Dmitry Volkogonov brings the number of executed to 900,000, so there are still discoveries going on in that area. How did the mechanism of terror work? Already between 1918 and 1923, the Bolsheviks unleashed the Red Terror to stay in power. In 1922, Vladimir Lenin wrote, "It would be the greatest mistake to think that the new economic policy has put an end to terror. We will return to terror and to economic terror," end quote. The collectivization in the early 1930s naturally met with peasant resistance, especially in the Ukraine. This resulted in Holodomor, an intentional starvation of Ukrainian people between 1932 and 1933, which modern Ukrainian state recognizes as genocide. November 26 is acknowledged as a Holodomor Remembrance Day worldwide. During that historical period, the police administration also forcibly deported over 1.8 million peasants who were branded as kulaks. In the 1930s, Moscow directed a series of terror campaigns. First in 1933-34, then in 1937-38, followed by the forced deportation of 13 entire ethnic minorities in the 1940s to remote areas of the Soviet Union. Once the directive from the center was received, the local secret police administration, or NKVD, organizations operationalized those directives and indeed radicalized everyday terror practices by mimicking the idea of overfulfillment of quota of production targets under the current 5-year economic plans. The targets of terror would be first identified, put on a list of undesirable persons, and later arrested. Once the lists were exhausted, the NKVD faced a dilemma where to get new targets. So sometimes they resorted to conducting mass roundups at markets and right on the streets in residential areas. Confessions were often obtained through torture. And in the countryside, for example, the NKVD used the reports from village councils that listed the economic position of peasantry, individual peasants, before collectivization, and used it as legitimate grounds for arrests and persecution. During campaign against nationalities, NKVD looked for individuals with suspicious last names and made that basis of arrests. Another terror tactic was obtaining the so-called testimony of detainees regarding their accomplices. The perpetrators tried to uncover not only individuals, so-called enemies of the people, and that term was coined out by Stalin personally, but looked for entire organizations who could be implicated. So after being tortured, prisoners often signed superficial confessions, leading to more arrests. Remarkably, every NKVD section employed their own so-called standby witness, ready to testify against citizens for perceived crimes. The terror was accompanied by constant reminders, and vague reminders for that matter, that the enemies of the state, camouflaged, were lurking everywhere. Stalin continued claiming at the same time that the class struggle intensifies with the advancement of socialism and does not diminish, despite yet another seemingly successful, from the standpoint of Soviet totalitarian government, successful campaign to eradicate class enemies. The government also resorted to ideological campaigns to cultivate public consent for terror and public approval of terror. So what groups of population did the terror affect? The simple answer is all of them. But today I will focus on one group in particular within the Soviet society to make a connection between terror and genocide, where a clear connection can be made, as our discussion attempts to draw parallels between different genocides across time and space. The Stalin regime systematically suppressed 13 entire nationalities by deporting them to remote areas of the USSR, and the process continued between 1937 and 1951. The Soviet authorities exiled the nationalities to the same exact areas where the kulaks were sent back in 1930 to 1933. These nationalities totaled 2 million people and included Soviet Koreans, Finns, Germans, Kalmyks, Chechens, Ingush, Balkars, Crimean Tatars, Georgian Kurds, Pontic Greeks, and others. The Soviet government justified their deportations by their alleged disloyalty to the regime. However, these deportations were based on ethnic and not at all political reasons. The NKVD loaded entire nations into unheated and overcrowded cars of trains at a gunpoint and transported them to new areas that were very different in terms of the way of life in comparison to what these nationalities were accustomed to. By July 1st, 1948, the NKVD recorded over 260,000 deaths among the exiled Soviet citizens from those nationalities. To show the scale of destruction, this represented 23.7% of the exiled people from North Caucasus. All of the exiled people from the North Caucasus. The deported groups were deprived of their ancestral homelands and their ethnic identity and became a subject of forced assimilation. The resolution of November 14th, 1989, going into the future, adopted by the Supreme Soviet of the USSR at the time, finally recognized majority of these national groups as so-called repressed peoples, and that's how they become known in historiography. The deported population was deprived of basic shelter, clothing, food, and worked in inhospitable conditions. For example, as late as May 1944, Stalin signed a resolution ordering all Crimean Tatars to be exiled from the territory of the Crimea and settled in such places as Uzbek Soviet Socialist Republic and others. Stalin personally signed most of the orders deporting ethnic Germans within the USSR. 19.6% of all the Crimean Tatars perished as a result of this forced deportation, so it's nearly 20%. Between 1932 and 1940, Soviet government exiled over 2.1 million people to these remote settlements. In 1933, the Gulag system, or the prison camp administration, cut food ratios of the special settlers by over 2/3. This amounted to mere 260 grams of food per day. Just to give you a comparison, in the besieged city of Leningrad during the war, the food ratio was 125 grams of bread per day. So that shows the comparison and the extent of this human tragedy. Settlers had difficulties finding employment. For instance, Kalmyks were not accustomed to different or Russian agricultural practices, and many couldn't really speak Russian. As late as 1946, 30% of able-bodied Kalmyk people in Novosibirsk region couldn't work due to lack of shoes. While being en route to their settlements, many prisoners were shot during the train stops if they managed to stray more than 5 meters away from the train. That was a punishable offense by shooting. The nationalities were stripped from learning their languages. For example, between 1939 and 1945, Korean language was only taught as a second language, and after 1945, Soviet schools didn't offer Korean language up until 1988. And as late as 1948, the interior minister, when Stalin was still alive, was ordered to construct new special purpose camps and prisons, which warrants no logical explanation at that time in history. Activists from among various oppressed peoples have maintained for a very long time that the deportations and the conditions of exile amounted to genocide. Finally, in April of 1991, the Russian government publicly agreed that the deportations and exile of the repressed peoples did constitute genocide. The original definition of genocide, as introduced by Raphael Lemkin's work, Access Rule in Occupied Europe, that Stephen already mentioned earlier, focused on the destruction of group identity rather than killing members of that group. Both lethal and non-lethal means could constitute genocide. By the time the United Nations passed the Treaty on the Prevention and Punishment of Genocide in December of 1948, the definition was narrowed down. Forced assimilation was left outside the legal definition of genocide. The narrower definition equated genocide primarily with ethnically motivated mass murder. The narrower definition, for instance, was adopted by French scholars who later on would study genocide in Rwanda. And they will arrive at and use this narrow definition of genocide in order to stress the horrors that that country experienced in 1994. This narrow definition of genocide also presents certain challenge to other repressed peoples of the former Soviet Union to press the genocide charges in cases when the group identity was destructed. So how did the Soviet state justify all this terror? Mass deportations of kulaks from Ukraine was explained through the need of collectivization and overcoming recent famine. The purges, the Great Terror of 1937 and 38 were justified as preemptive in the face of the growing, looming threat of war. Inside the NKVD that also wasn't spared the purges, many operatives were accused of harboring subversive ideology. Another explanation points out to Stalin's personality, and Stalin was certainly known as being paranoid in terms of seeing internal and external enemies everywhere. But his approach to terror was indeed rational. He skillfully manipulated one group against the other. But Stalin was not alone in perpetrating terror. In terms of the daily practices of terror, the typical perpetrators can be divided into two groups. The first being driven by ideology, being fanatical, and believing in seeing enemies everywhere. In fact, many people in this group were sadists. The second type were the opportunists who pursued careers and personal enrichment in any cost, at any cost. In the words of one NKVD official, I quote, "I wanted to live well, have power, be in charge," end of quote. In reality, the profile of a typical perpetrator combined all the above characteristics: fanatical beliefs, fear of arrest, feeling of being a superior human being in terms of belonging to this corporate identity, NKVD, as well as psychological predisposition towards violence. Thus, by late 1930s, there emerged a complex relationship between the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, the criminal justice system, and the so-called general public. The troubling truth is that no comprehensive investigation of Stalin or his NKVD operatives, field operatives, or leadership against Soviet people was ever conducted. There was no trial ever conducted. Stalin purges of the NKVD personnel were simply a political cover-up for the crimes committed during the Great Terror, and the only case of execution of a secret police official was execution of Lavrentiy Beria, highly publicized in 1953. In conclusion, Stalin died in 1953, and in 1956, the purges were condemned and victims were rehabilitated. If you allow me a bit of a personal reflection here, my fraternal grandfather was one of such victims of Stalinist terror, and he too was rehabilitated after spending over 10 years in one of those Stalinist labor camps above the Arctic Circle. And I actually never met him. The explanations behind the cessation of terror include, in some cases, a more humanistic nature of post-Stalinist leaders. Others explain the cessation of terror by the recognition that terror was no longer effective in motivating the workforce or increasing production. Other theory claims that bureaucracy didn't want to purge itself. And perhaps this presents a partial explanation as to why Stalinism as a phenomenon continued after Stalin's death, albeit in its reimagined form, when the terror tactics lingered in a much more targeted, indirect, and in some ways more hidden and nuanced ways. Some of these terror tactics, including the notion of enemies of the people and the concept of undesirable organizations, are making their alarming return in today's Russia. So that would conclude my comments.
Thank you very much. And we will now move over to Seb.
Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much, Stephen and Larissa, for these very insightful talks. Also, thank you to Keith for organizing this series of events, and also thank you again to Keith and Stephen for participating in last week's event at the Holocaust Remembrance Day event. Just a side note, if you were not able to make it to the event last week when we had a Holocaust survivor speak to us, And there is a recording coming out shortly, so we are going to share that actually. I'd also like to acknowledge that I'm joining from the traditional lands of the Stolo people today. I think I'm one of the few people actually on campus. You can see the background here. I was trying to run a class this morning and not too many students actually showed up. I wonder why. Okay, I would like to share also my slideshow, and then I would like to start talking a little bit about a supposedly lesser known genocide, the Herero genocide. Just give me 1 second for technical details here. Okay, Herero genocide of 1904. Yeah, I would like to deliberate on this rather lesser known genocide that occurred in the early 20th century, the Herero genocide. I think it's important to include cases that typically do not often enter the center stage, so to speak. And I'm not entirely sure why that is, why we sometimes talk more about some genocides rather than others. But I think such discussions can still be very fruitful and important because they can still allow us possibly to draw on larger conclusions and make general kinds of findings and insights. When it comes to the history of the Holocaust, when it comes to the history of genocide in general, when it comes to the history of mass murder and the sociology behind violence. In short, I think there's still a lot we can learn from when it comes to cases or case studies of genocide that are less well known. Furthermore, I think a glance at such case studies might also allow us to place them in larger contexts, relational contexts with these cases that perhaps are a little bit more well-known, such as the Holocaust. We might be able to make connections and reveal certain continuities and relationships over time and space that might illustrate that some genocides, including the ones that we're discussing today, in fact served as a pretext to the larger later genocides that are more well-known. And finally, also just a word, introductory remark, I'd like to make it known that I think it is absolutely essential to include cases of mass violence and genocide when it comes to the history of Africa and Asia. I think when we want to sharpen our kind of, global lens, so to speak, I think we need to break through this kind of, Eurocentric or Western kind of perspectives that we often take. And when it comes to the history of Africa and mass violence in Africa and genocide, I think we often also tend to take a kind of post-colonial kind of lens. Not that there's anything wrong with a post-colonial lens, so to speak. I mean, the history of decolonization is a very important one and also kind of a trendy one. But I think when it comes to, for instance, the case of the Rwandan genocide, which I originally wanted to talk about, I think we can kind of see this, what I mean with post-colonialism, where we kind of, have these sometimes simplified narratives where we say the Europeans got into the African subcontinent, exploited the continent, subjugated the indigenous peoples over hundreds of years, and then basically decolonized the continent, often involuntarily after the Second World War, leaving behind a shattered continent, so to speak. And it is then the local peoples, in the case of Rwanda, the Tutsi and the Hutu, so to speak, who started fighting with one another. And then sometimes, we kind of get this impression that it is the local peoples that need to figure out, so to speak, and there are problems in Africa. But of course, that is a very much of an oversimplification, so to speak. There is pre-context and there's histories that need to be unraveled, so to speak. And it also kind of exonerates the Europeans, actually, the colonizers in that case, so to speak, if we just look at the African people themselves who are struggling with one another when it comes to cases of mass violence and genocide. Again, Rwanda comes to mind here. And I think the other part of the story here is that it is not simply that the Europeans came, colonized, exploited a continent. And by the way, Africa is not the only one, so to speak. And this is my main point here, actually. There were also cases of genocide and mass violence committed in Africa, in Asia, by the colonizer. So that's what I mean, not just post-colonial, we need something more. We also need the colonial lens here as well. The genocide against the Herero nation is sometimes labeled as the first genocide of the 20th century. And that actually already kind of brings forward the importance of studying this very case of mass violence. Why is it the first case of genocide in the 20th century? Because it happened in the years 1904, 1905, 1906. It was committed and it was organized by the German Empire, so a colonial force, in other words, that led to the near extermination of the Herero people, a nation that is located in present-day Namibia. At the time, this area, today's Namibia, was labeled or called or referred to as German Southwest Africa. And if you look here at the map, you can see the location of German Southwest Africa, today's Namibia. Piece by piece, lands in Namibia were purchased or taken over in the late 1800s, which is when the Germans started settling over that land. Germany itself, so a little bit of context here I think is crucial, was recently unified in 1871. So in a sense was a latecomer to this game of colonizing different parts of the world. So we could argue therefore that one reason to go into one of the last corners of Africa and to acquire land was in a sense to join this concert of great powers that were already established, or that already had established themselves as colonizers in Africa, in Asia, and beyond. It was a bit of a catch-up game in a sense for the country that clearly demonstrated this display of, fermenting feelings of nationalism and of imperialism. In fact, Germany and the United States of America, maybe here's one of the first similarities we can touch on in the Q&A once Keith has given his talk. In fact, Germany and the US were relatively new nation states, and both, I think, pursued a kind of national policy of expansionism and nation-making. A manifest destiny, ? A kind of God-given right to expand, ? Again, something to pick on later in our question and answer period. So Germany was a relative latecomer to the game of colonizing and of expanding to becoming an imperial power akin to what Great Britain, France, and other European powers already had kind of accomplished. Whoever would stand in the way of Germany to acquire a place under the sun, as the slogan went back then, would be dealt with accordingly. Now, a number of historians have pondered if Germany's late start to that game, so to speak, to this colonial race, led to a more harsh, a more rushed, and a more brutal kind of treatment of the local populations and ensuing policies. By 1900, around 5,000 German farmers had settled in German Southwest Africa, who specialized in ranching. And here on this image, you can see kind of how diverse the landscape of Namibia actually was, from more arid areas to more ranch land, grassing lands. More immigrants, of course, meant more pressure on this precious grazing land. And the Germans took, unsurprisingly, the best land and thereby drove the local populations into gradual poverty. So there's this kind of pauperization process happening, as they could not conduct their traditional lifestyle, a pastoral lifestyle. They were also ranchers, and the Herero people used to have cattle. That's how they sustained themselves. There was further talk to build a railway line right through the country, through the colony, bringing in more settlers, and also putting to Herero people eventually into reservations. And there's another key word which I'd like to pick on later in our Q&A, subjugating peoples and then putting peoples into ghettos, into, like Stephen was referring to, into gulags, as Larissa was referring to, and into reservations, which is a term that we often associate with when it comes to, the history of North America, of course, Canada and the United States. In 1904, finally, after many protests by the Herero had not brought any significant improvement, they finally rose up and started to kill some of the colonial settlers, so the German settlers. Between 120 to 150 or so, we estimate, were killed or massacred. Though we need to make one further distinction. The Herero leadership made it clear that children and women were not to be targeted. And I don't think that's an insignificant remark that we need to keep in mind here when it comes to genocide, because genocide is typically the killing or the targeting of groups as such, and distinctions between men, women, and children technically are not made. The Herero leader, his name was Samuel Maharero, famously said, and I think I have an image here of kind of German Southwest Africa, again, today's Namibia, how the land looked like, the ranching, and the reason why German settlers wanted to immigrate and kind of start a new life, so to speak, as ranchers in that land. The Herero leader, Samuel Herero, famously said, "Let us die fighting rather than die as a result of maltreatment." And later on, he said, "Our weak nations all over Africa should stand up. Let them rather finish us off than let them live alone in our country." So I think he was trying to kind of, have a bit of a unifying effect, so to speak, trying to galvanize other indigenous nations and ethnicities within the African continent, and then kind of to collectively resist European penetration and European subjugation of the continent. He was to be disappointed. Expectedly, the colonial governor in German Southwest Africa, once the uprising started in 1904, requested military support from Berlin, and the German emperor sent 10,000 soldiers, which is an extraordinary number. As we can see, the prime reason for the escalation of violence was the German attempt to crush a rebellion that the state considered as offensive and also as kind of an affront against a white supremacist state. In the German view, it was out of a military necessity, in other words. It was a military necessity that we need to send soldiers to Namibia and deal accordingly with the insurgents, so to speak. And now this military conflict, or what the Germans considered a military necessity to intervene, led to this attempted annihilation of an entire people. Some historians have also argued that this pretext of crushing a rebellion was more than a textbook military maneuver. That's not what it is. It's much, much more. In fact, it was a welcome opportunity in a sense for German nationalists and German imperialists and German militarists, right? They're intersecting here, militarists, nationalists, imperialists. This kind of was a welcomed opportunity to show the world German military might. And again, we're talking about a relative newcomer, a newly unified country, and it was kind of considered as a chance, so to speak, to kind of show the rest of the world how tough we are. This was mixed, again, probably unsurprisingly, with a gross display of European racism and feelings of white superiority that were quite common at the turn of the century in the Western world. The general in charge of crushing the rebellion was General von Trotha. I think I have an image of him here as well with a quote, who said, "They only respond to force. It was and is my policy to use force with terrorism and even brutality. I shall annihilate the revolting tribes with rivers of blood and gold. Only after a complete uprooting will something emerge." And then it was the German military eventually that defeated the Herero nation at the Battle of Waterberg, again in the summer, early fall of 1904. But if this quote in front of us is not strong evidence that we are talking about a genocidal policy in the making here, then the following quotes might change our mind here. Here's a photo of colonial troops, German troops in Africa. This is the Battle of Waterberg that I was just referring to. It was kind of a decisive battle from a military standpoint in 1904 that kind of crushed the military resistance of the Herero. But yeah, back to my point, when it comes to quotations, to look for further evidence how deeply entrenched this kind of genocidal policy in the making was, then these further quotes here might change our mind. The colonial society stated at the time, Europeans can assert themselves only by maintaining the supremacy of their race at all costs. That is, I think, quite unequivocal language. Von Trotha further stated, no war may be conducted humanely against non-humans. No war may be conducted humanely against non-humans. And now I think we're all kind of seeing parallels to other genocides here that already have been referred to in this panel and other ones as well. On October the 2nd, in 1904, von Trotha gave his infamous annihilation order of Vernichtungsbefehl, saying the Herero people must leave this land. If it does not, I will force it to do so by using the great gun. I will no longer receive women or children, but I will drive them back to their people or have them shot at. So again, there's no real compromise or middle room, so to speak, for negotiating and making a peace settlement. And this is very stark language. Paul Rohrbach, who was the land commissioner working for the German government at the time, said, I believe the Herero nation must be destroyed as such. And especially these last two words here, I think, are very, very indicative when it comes to the Genocide Convention, to the formal language that we nowadays use. And Keith already made reference to it, the UN Convention that was passed in 1948. There is exactly these two words that are part of the definition, as such. And we have that kind of pretext, so to speak, which makes it very clear what the German colonizing intentions were at the time. From the point of view of the economy of the country, the Hottentots, as they were called back then, are generally regarded in the wider sense as useless and in this respect providing no justification for the preservation of their race. Another cruel kind of testimony right there. And I think we can make some references later in our Q&A as well with Stephen's talk when it comes to the Holocaust, like when the Nazis were contemplating what to do with the Jewish populations. I think there's a number of factors that come into play, right? To exploit them economically, to use Jewish forced labor, so to speak. But when this was no longer an incentive or no longer feasible or no longer wanted, then basically the next more escalating kind of consequence would ensue, so to speak, and that is mass murder. And we kind of see a similar kind of rhetorics happening here as well. As long as the people were useful, the indigenous peoples in this context, they could be exploited. Once that point has passed, so to speak, and that quote is exactly making that point, they're considered as useless, then there's no point to preserve their race. I think from these quotes, there are a number of things that then we can infer. The quotes clearly go beyond military strategy. They preclude or actually exclude any kind of settlement, a kind of peace treaty that usually happens after military conflict. This was not about a defeated party that had to sacrifice some land, make some punishments to the victors, etc. No, this is a conflict that turned into an existential conflict for the Herero people. When von Trotha referred to women and children in the quote above here, he was not pondering on military strategy, but he was pondering on genocide, the disappearance of a group as such. And that, again, that is the conventional definition of the UN genocide definition. The other element that comes out in these statements, again, the economic factor, if indigenous peoples were considered not economically valuable, they were considered a hindrance. And again, other genocides here might come to mind. When the Hereros were crushed at the Battle of Waterberg in 1904, the remaining Hereros were pushed into the deserts to simply disappear, problem solved in the German mind, or they were actually taken as prisoners, the ones who were able-bodied and fit and young, and put into so-called concentration camps. So here we can see kind of a prototype of concentration camps used one of the first times by the European colonizers. And again, of course, something that would be later on copied again. So in conclusion, of the 80,000 Herero people who were around in the year 1900, fewer than 15,000 people survived this genocide. So in percentage, you can do the math, that is less than 25%, less than 20%, pardon me. A final point I would like to make is that while the prevailing racism at the time was quite universal and shared again with the Western world in more general terms, there were also some sporadic voices of opposition. And they were raised inside of Germany and also outside of Germany. And I think they're very, very illuminating and indicative in terms of the discourses that were prevailing at that time. In fact, in 1907, at the federal election in Germany, these elections were called the Hottentot elections because it was such a kind of controversial topic that was discussed in German society at that time. And it was working class organizations and the working class organ, the Social Democratic Party, the SPD. It was actually taking the side of the Herero and was basically criticizing and criticizing the imperial government for the atrocities committed in Africa. The justifications, so the government being on the defensive end here, the justifications voiced at this time, like I just said a second ago, are quite telling and indicative. The example of the United States was used as a precedent and was used as an excuse for German colonial brutality. The Secretary for Colonial Affairs, for instance, his name was Bernhard Dernburg, in the 1907 speech said, and I think I have that here. Yeah, sorry to show you some photos here of the genocide. So here we can see resettlements as in people taking them into forced labor camps and literally putting the people on chains. Oops, I thought I had that quote, pardon me. Back to here. In the 1907 speech said, so again, the Secretary for Colonial Affairs, Mr. Dernburg, said, the English traders had sold alcohol and weapons to the native people and thus brought about conditions in which large masses of people were destroyed. So he's making that comparison, 1600s, the colonizing of New England to what the Germans were doing in the early 1900s. He further says, of course, there can be no question that in the process of civilization, some native tribes, just like some animals, must be destroyed if they are not to degenerate and become encumbrances to the state. The history of colonization in the United States, surely the greatest effort at colonizing the world that the world has ever seen, had at its first act the total annihilation of the original inhabitants. So what the German government is basically doing is kind of trying to trivialize something, trying to relativize something, and trying to kind of exonerate themselves, as in saying, you know, what we have been doing here is relatively normal. There's many historical precedents throughout time and space. And that, of course, is the purpose for us coming together today, right? Talking about genocide over time and space. And I think I'd rather stop here with my little presentation and look forward to our discussion following Keith's talk. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Seb. And if you could, stop sharing your screen and. Are people seeing my view screen or the presentation screen? Feeling this isn't working properly. I'm going to drop down to a single screen. I'm having trouble here. All right. There. Thank you to all of the co-panelists here today for sharing these very difficult stories, these very deeply disturbing stories. I'd like to pull this over now to the North American continent and to an area that has actual big implications for British Columbia, because it actually serves more as a testing ground for the form of settler colonialism that we see here than other parts of Canada in some regards. So, and I want to talk about structures in some important ways. The settler colonialism I mean, Seb was just speaking about basically an effort by the German Empire to transform Namibia from an extraction colonial situation into a settler colonial situation. And so I'm talking about that settler colonial context. Within settler colonialism, Indigenous people are defined as problems because they are in the way. And what are they in the way of? Well, land and resources. And settler colonialism is predicated on the need to displace and then replace Indigenous people. It therefore operates with what Patrick Wolf calls a logic of elimination. It destroys in order to replace. And settler colonialism seeks to minimize the risk for settler society when it does this. It therefore looks for inexpensive ways to displace Indigenous people that do not necessarily pose high risks to high risk of Indigenous violent retaliation. And so in Canada and North America, we see the creation of reserves or reservations, as they're called in the United States, economic and political marginalization, the creation of residential schools. These are all seen as low risk ways, low cost ways with low risks to displace and replace Indigenous peoples. And why is my slide not advancing? There we go. Now, for Indigenous people, the most dangerous period of colonization in North America is that where you transition from extraction colonialism into settler colonialism. So that is to say, when you shift from the fur trade, which is a very essentially a mild form of extraction colonialism with very little control by the trading companies, to a gold rush situation like we see in California, later in British Columbia, and then from the gold rush to settlement. Within this context, colonizers have not yet invested in the long-term residency in the region that they're exploiting. The miners, for the most part, don't have intentions to stay and settle down in the areas that they're mining. They're there to make as much money as quickly as they can and then leave. And these colonizers, of course, are typically men who do not have families and therefore are not worried about potential Indigenous reprisals against wives and children. And extraction colonialism and settler colonialism are not typically motivated by racism, although racism, and if we think of it here as that gaze of whiteness, it serves as a way that colonizers justify and rationalize the colonization, which can then turn into genocide. For example, these people of color are too primitive to use the land properly, therefore we can start to colonize displace, and replace. They are too primitive to have systems of organized government for us to negotiate with. Therefore, it's not our fault that we haven't negotiated with them the way that we would with a cognate European country. These people do not have the attributes and the systems that we expect them to have. And therefore, they look different to us. And what makes them look different to us, primarily, of course, and quickly, is the color of their skin. Right? And so in that way, whiteness enables colonizers to perceive and to treat people who, through the lens of settler colonialism, are regarded as problems, and transform those people into people who are additionally seen as people with problems, and therefore people who need to be fixed, to be corrected, to be altered. This enables settlers to develop and apply policies that they can define for themselves and for the colonized people as being benevolent acts of generosity, what's come to be known broadly as the white man's burden after Kipling's poem. And they can also say that through their government policies, they are taking actions to protect Indigenous people from the greed and corruption of their own settler society. And this is really important, right? This is the idea that we need to control Indigenous people, because if we don't, settler society will run amok. The freedom of the settlers will cause the violence and the genocide. So they say things, for example, like, we will protect you by making you wards of our state and making decisions for you. We will protect you by keeping you on reserves over which we hold title. We will look after your interests by assimilating your children into our society. Now, how does this play out in California? California, it's Indigenous territory. It's then becomes Spanish colony, and it is colonized. The Mexicans becomes independent part of the Mexican Empire in 1821, and then it becomes occupied by Americans in 1846 during the Mexican-American War, and then eventually becomes a state in the United States. The American ranchers who arrive and start arriving in significant numbers in 1846, 47, 48, were empowered by laws that already existed, by earlier Spanish laws that would enable them to compel Indigenous people to work for them, to extract labor from Indigenous people. One law permitted American settlers to abduct Indigenous children, to exploit their labor, and another law made it impossible, quote, for a white man to be convicted on the testimony of an Indian. And so white settlers, American settlers, are moving in. They're literally abducting young children, youths, people under the age of 21, and compelling them to be laborers on their farm and or ranches or their mines later. And they're also turning to adult Indigenous men and women. And in those cases, if you're over the age of 21, they can compel you to be, they can say you are a vagrant, and that your labor then can be directed towards the white settler for periods of up to 4 months without compensation. So in California, this exploitation of Indigenous children in particular was really indistinguishable from the treatment of African-American slaves in certain other parts of the United States, because while a parent could come and complain that a settler had kidnapped their children and taken their children away, the white settler only had to say that he did it with those parents' permission, and they're now changing their mind, therefore breach of contract. And because he could not be convicted on the testimony of an Indigenous person, the Indigenous parents had no legal standing. John Sutter's Mill is sort of the launch of what's known in California as the big gold rush of 1849, the miners' 49ers that you might have heard about in that children's song, My Darling Clementine. And at that mill, his primary source of labor was Indigenous people, compelled Indigenous slave labor at those mines. But when word of the gold on Sutter's Mill got out more broadly, a massive flood of people, mostly young men, white men from around the United States and other parts of the world, flood into California, over 60,000. And they are looking for gold. And their treatment of Indigenous peoples is despicable. It's worse even than what had happened in the years preceding. The forced servitude that I mentioned continued, but it's compounded by an extremely well-documented genocidal war in which groups of American militia were paid to take whatever means they felt justified to remove Indigenous people from lands where gold was plentiful. And this included just simple murders, exterminations. But to get paid, the bounty hunters, the settlers, would come back with scalps. And so it was white settlers who were scalping indigenous people, cutting off their scalp, bringing that back to the local militias and local American governments, and then being compensated upon the production of those scalps. And during this time, 1849, 50, 51, 52, this is the period of genocidal activities, full-on genocidal activities. The governor of California, Peter Burnett, says that the war of extermination will continue to be waged between the two races until the Indian race becomes extinct. Now, scholars have determined that more than 100,000 indigenous people were enslaved, killed, or died immediately as consequences of enslavement within the colonial period. That's the enslavement. That doesn't include the additional 16,000 minimum that were killed in cold-blooded murders by Americans, either by the organized militias or by the individual bounty hunters who went out to scalp indigenous people and then collect the bounty fees. This needs to be understood within the context of the idea that Seb had raised earlier of manifest destiny. This idea that God had given Protestant Anglos in the United States and the Eastern Seaboard the right, the divine right, to push westward and to claim the continent, to claim it vis-a-vis other competing European claimants, i.e. the British, the French, the Spanish, but also to claim and displace that land from its indigenous inhabitants. Now, in Canada, we have something very similar to this. It's not quite as robust. It's not quite as celebrated in our school systems in the past. But the Canadian government, when we became independent of Britain, we became a dominion. That language was chosen intentionally from the Bible, which refers to the dominion from sea to sea, and then from through the rivers to all the ends of the earth. And so both in Canada and the United States was the sense that with with settlement comes civilization, and civilization would bring light, technology, rationalism, and it would displace the indigenous people. And on the cutting edge of that process of creating a settler colonial state, there would be violence, because it's in that area, of course, as later is articulated in the 1890s by Frederick Jackson Turner, it's in that cutting edge of settler colonialism where the violence occurs, and where what is now referred to as hypermasculinity, toxic masculinity, is simply allowed to unfold, because it's seen as creating the context and the situation that we need for that greater good that would follow. The greater good being the arrival of white women and children and schools and markets and economies and all of that sort of thing. Now, I talk about, and I wanted to talk about the California gold rush and the genocide that occurred there, incredibly well documented, because it was that genocide that spills up with its attitudes into British Columbia. So when British Columbia shifts from being, from a British perspective, a fur trade jurisdiction of the Hudson Bay Company into the colony of British Columbia in 1858, it's because over 30,000 miners have come from California and now moved into the Fraser River for that region, what is now between Hope and Lytton, 30,000 American miners. And they bring with them the attitudes that they had in California. These are miners and ranchers who are coming up here to make quick money and then leave. And they embark upon what one miner describes in his diaries as a war of extermination in the Fraser Canyon. And indeed, 7 Stalo and Nakamook villages are burned and razed to the ground in the summer of 1858, in June and July of 1858. And even when there's peace is brought to that situation, or I should say a military truce, which is led by the efforts of Look Spinthlam, who was the Nakamook leader from what is now Lytton, the Thompson Nakamook people, and by Sliquatum, who was the Stalo leader from what is now Yale. They bring peace to that situation, mitigate the outbreaks of violence. It still did not change the fact that as those American miners were leaving in 1859, 60, 61, 62, they started to grab young Stalo indigenous boys on their way home and took them back with them to California, where they became slaved indentured servants in the California ranching economy. The number of young Stala boys that were kidnapped, we do not know. We do know that contemporary observers said a great many. We do know that observers of the time, both European and Indigenous, describe parents who are at an absolute loss of what to do. One father who was off into the forest and basically starves himself to death because of his grief at losing his son. And so what we see is a system of genocide occurring here in Canada, which is now being talked about in many interesting debates around, do residential schools constitute genocide? Does the displacement of Indigenous people onto reserves constitute genocide? Were there intentional spreads of deadly infections, smallpox and others, and do they constitute genocide? And I think all of those conversations need to be situated within the context of this earlier, larger genocide, which took place in California and which then was transmitted up here and then shaped the relations with Indigenous people as this province was first being created. So, Lahai, thank you very much. And I look forward to the questions and conversations. So if you're a guest here today, one of the people who have signed in, please feel free to type in a message into the chat and I will pick it up and bring that to the panelists. But until those appear, I am going to turn to our panelists and ask if they have any questions for one another that have emerged from our conversations today. Seb, it sounded like you had some as you were doing your presentation. Do you want to roll in and...
Question's a good word. I mean, there's so many things that are going through my head right now, and I'm looking for similarities and relationships, right? How we can kind of find a common denominator and bring the four together. I mean, one question I often ponder when I have studied genocide studies as a PhD student, and sometimes I teach that in my history of violence classes, that notion of modernity, like to what degree modernity, right? This kind of inherent belief in progress, in civilization, in creating utopian societies, how modernism is a driving factor behind kind of mass violence. And I kind of can see it in all our four cases right now. I mean, Larissa's referring to this communist utopia where we're trying to re-engineer, reform kind of a society and try to create a better world, a better society. And the people who don't fit in, they get located in the gulag, so to speak, and kind of get dealt with and isolated, segregated, and they're done with, so to speak. In the Holocaust, obviously that happened. I mean, the notion of racism, of anti-Semitism. Okay, anti-Semitism itself maybe is not necessarily that modern, but what the Nazis tried to create, a master race, creating living space, and again, exploiting human beings to kind of realize and manifest these dreams is quite modern. And then, of course, what you were just talking about, Keith, right? The manifest destiny, white civilization, the civilizing project, so to speak, bringing progress, railways in that image into the land, so to speak, and improving the land and taking it away from people who are seeing inferior, less developed. I mean, that's so striking. And in the case of Africa, there's a lot of congruence and a lot of similarities. So again, just wondering what you guys think about this. Is it modernity that really brought so much destruction and violence to the world? Because, I mean, the history of violence in itself is not new, right? There's always been wars and killings and crushing rebellions, military conflicts, stating the obvious. But I think there is something peculiar about modern genocide.
It looked like Larissa was about to speak, so we'll pass it to Larissa.
Yeah, thank you so much, Seb, for raising this point. And to that end, there was rapid modernization, of course, happening, called it almost a second Russian industrial revolution happening in the Soviet Union in the 1930s, both in terms of agriculture, in terms of collectivization and gigantic industrial projects, in terms of industrialization. And for that reason, the industry had to be fed, and this grain collection quota had to be implemented, and hard currency needed to be collected while trading grain and getting the currency to buy the more machinery, sometimes wholesale, sometimes from class enemies of the Soviet Union, such as the United States. So it was a lot of hypocrisy involved around the modernity drive. But in this process, of course, millions of Ukrainians, for example, suffered, and numbers vary. The more conservative estimate talks about between 3.5 and 5 million people perishing in the man-made famine in Ukraine in the 1930s. Greater numbers established by the UN talk between 7 and 10 millions. And this is where the discrepancy in estimate comes in. the Soviet Union and now its successor, sort of titular state Russia, continues to deny Holodomor and cases of genocide in Ukraine, because the historians there, official or otherwise, claim that these were excesses of modernization and nothing else. And they are applicable equally to Ukraine as it is in Russia proper. Whereas Ukrainian side has officially stated and established it through law as of 2006 that it was indeed genocide. So which result of which outcome was it? The deliberate man-made starvation of the population or misplaced industrialization drive? So those narratives are still being debated.
Thank you. Steve, thoughts on Seb's question about modernization in the Holocaust?
Yeah, I think it's a really good one. And, you know, a lot of things come to mind. I think, you know, the shift to, you know, the words utopian certainly fit. The individual, so we see, you know, the rise of you know, popular politics and the individual, but also then the individual becomes, you know, the individual flourish within the collective good. So then what's the collective good, right, in a lot of these movements? And so they're different in each context, right? Each one of these movements have to be contextualized, and they have been here, right? And so for the Germans at that time during Nazi Germany, the rise of that movement in that period, it was a folkish dictatorship. So which means it's for the people, and the argument was, you know, kind of by the people, but it hinged on the people's buy-in. And we don't get that so much in Stalinism, right? And it's a different context. It's like, it's not, it's a multi-ethnic empire and so on. And then who's useful and who's not, and who fits in and who doesn't is the question. And for the Germans at that time, it wasn't, you know, we focus in on their main target, the Jewish people. Another group is also targeted for annihilation, the Roman Sinti people. And of course, many others were targeted and lost their lives, but not for annihilation, right? Because the belief was that they could become good Aryans if they just changed their mind or did something better or something like that, or they were not as significant. But within that, there's a movement to what they call purify the Aryan race. So simultaneously, you have these movements within Germany to end things like anxiety and colorblindness and all these things, which you can see at the Gestapo, remnants of the Gestapo building in Berlin. They call them different names, but if you look at them, that's what they are, right? And so these kind of everyday things that we have in our life that we just consider part of society or whatever, these things that were considered, whatever they deemed to be impure or somehow lessening the purity and the goodness or the moving forward in a pure way, had to be eradicated as well. So it was a thoroughgoing campaign that was not just aimed at ethnic outsiders or racial outsiders. So I think it could be a lot said here, but I think we're running out of time. So I think it's a great question, and there's a lot of stuff that comes out of that for sure. And there's also the aesthetic component, right, of that we see in totalitarian movements, of combining all the individuals into a mass movement, and then seeing yourself in that mass movement. So the buy-in is then, you know, pretty solid and not questioned, right, so much. So anyway, yeah, lots there.
Yeah, thank you for everybody. I see Lee Holler has said, haven't there been many examples of genocide prior to modernity? And so perhaps what Steve refers to most, it's the idea of the normalness of it. But I think that might also fit, I think, with Seb's idea about progress, maybe more broadly than modernity. It does seem to me that in every one of these cases, what is always at play is this idea of the othering, right? Once we can other and dehumanize someone, we're able to treat them in ways that we that are reprehensible, but that we somehow are able to tolerate, and to go home and have dinner and read a book and play with our family and children, right, at the end of that day. Sorry. Yeah, so I think that othering process that we're seeing, and it's happening, you know, all over the place. Like we've given examples today of in a case, essentially all of these are European examples, or European descent people like North Americans who are oppressing others. But we see this with the Japanese in Manchuria and Korea. We see this, this is something that is happening universally, it seems to me. Was there anything that emerged for any of you from your colleagues' presentations that just sort of sparked a new thought, or perhaps a new way of seeing things that you hadn't occurred to you before? And if so, would anybody like to share anything like that?
I think there's also more questions right now in the Q&A.
I only saw, oh, sorry, there is. I didn't scroll down. Sorry. Let's do that then. Here's one is dovetailing with what Seb was saying, sort of, is the idea that genocide is seen throughout history as a general consensus of those who study this theme, or are there others who argue that genocide as a phenomenon is distinct to modernity, or that there are specific features about modernity that stimulate it?
I think there are aspects. Can I just jump in here for a second?
Yeah, please.
Definitely. There's a book by Norman Naimark that came out in 2016 on the world history of genocide, and that's a good book to consider. Norman is an excellent historian of mostly the 20th century, but Soviet Union, Germany, and so there are. And the thing is, I guess we want to look at how genocide changes over time. It's one of our themes here too, right? And so that's something that's worth noting. And there's a couple of comments here that, and some of them will also overlap, right? I mean, they're not necessarily, all acts of mass violence and targeting people are not necessarily born out of modernity, even today, right? If we look at some of the mass violence in the world, there are some that maybe ring a bit more familiar to hundreds of years ago, right, in terms of how people thought and how they proceeded in their military campaigns and violence, mass violence, and political violence. So it's not necessarily exclusive to time, although generally we see, I think, some of these things that Seb pointed out in studying 20th century phenomena that are somewhat different. The notion of a nation, right? That's a modern notion, and we look at the last couple hundred years there and what motivates people, what's the buy-in, and again back to what I was just talking about the Folkish movement in Germany. And it's not the only kind, but that's definitely a good example of we are the German people, right? And that's relatively new in human history, right? That we belong to a kingdom, we belong to where our loyalties would be different in terms of this national identity. So those are some things off the top of my mind. Yeah. Thank
you. We have a question from Jared Smith for the whole panel, but I'll direct it to Larissa so that we can spread this around a bit. It's a long type question, but he says at the end, how do you interpret the atrocities that have been discussed here when comparing them to the possible nuclear fallout we are facing with North Korea, as well as the threatened possible war with Russia? Is humanity destined to recreate history, or are all of the world powers simply walking on eggshells in correspondence with each other?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. And two quick thoughts come to mind. One is, of course, a political culture of the nation state that we are addressing and considering and examining. And secondly, the personal sort of predisposition towards violence of a political leader. And what we've seen in North Korea, of course, successively, as well as Russia in the 20th century, we see a successive lineup of leaders who don't hesitate to use violence, neither towards their own population, for that matter, that's also a marker, nor towards others. And this tense climate today that we are all watching with apprehension, of course, and sometimes it appears that we are on the brink of major war. I think this is a good illustration of a role of personality in history in a certain state that already had inherent features in its history towards isolationism, towards authoritarianism, and then indeed full-blown totalitarianism in the 20th century. So it's really a combination of man and state, an ability to manipulate the masses in between.
Thank you. I wonder for all of the panelists here, what about moving forward? I mean, there are always questions about reparations that can be made or should be made, and what role that is. Some societies have tried that, others have not. Others, about preventing it from ever happening again, and the various mechanisms, international or national, that we've put into place. Maybe we'll start with Seb, and then just quickly, maybe could all of you provide sort of your reflections on, are there things that work to prevent genocides?
Whoa, big question, big topic. Kind of makes me relate also to the talk, of course, last week, right, when we had the Holocaust. So whoever come visit UFV, and some people in the audience ask how can we prevent future genocide? And again, maybe just going in circles, but I think having that interest, the curiosity, coming together to learn about it, to engage in meaningful conversations, to ask questions, to get informed, and also that kind of that hunger to learn from the past and to see the relevance and make connections to the present day, so to speak, I think is that ultimately the most important step, so to speak. If we're indifferent to what happened in our country's past, what's happening in the world in the past and today, then I think we're on the wrong track, so to speak. So just in simple words, education, getting out there, learning, asking, engaging with one another, and learning from one another, I think is so absolutely crucial. Just in relation to the talk I was just giving, I've given about the Herero, that's a really interesting case. Of course, I'm also somewhat familiar with the Holocaust, and Stephen will speak about what Germany did or didn't do after the Holocaust in terms of reparations and the questions of seeking justice, the Nuremberg trials, right? Or trying the guilty, the criminal, the perpetrators and whatnot. With Rwanda, not Rwanda, with the Herero in Namibia, even though it happened, or it preceded the Holocaust more than 100 years ago, there was a long silence when it comes to unraveling the past, learning from it, and just getting the facts out, so to speak, kind of public history, right? Within society in a more general sense, so to speak. But it's changing in the last 10, 20 years dramatically. So it happened before the Holocaust, but the kind of Vergangenheitsbewältigung, coming to the terms with the past, happened actually after Holocaust historiography, so to speak. So kind of Holocaust studies become genocide studies in a kind of German way almost, so to speak. Anyways, long story short, Namibia is asking for apologies. They're asking for money for reparations, et cetera, and the German government during the Cold War said kind of, this is not our responsibility, so to speak. It was, an imperial government that no longer exists. There's this kind of detachment, but it is a different zeitgeist. It is a different kind of spirit that we're talking about right now. And the German government kind of has made leeways, made some progress, so to speak, to meet in the middle. There is now forgiveness. There are now commemorative events. There are now payments being made. Again, as we speak, only 1 year ago, the German government agreed to call it genocide. It has taken over 100 years to use that word genocide, but now it is becoming common parlance, so to speak. And we probably will see it in a year or two. Anyways, in the near future, that the head of state, the German president or chancellor, probably will visit Namibia and ask officially kind of for forgiveness. So it is kind of in the making. Again, shows the relevance of history, right? It's not a done deal. It's ongoing. The legacies are right there and they're contested. And the stories, it's anyways, sorry, my answer is much longer than I thought.
No, thank you.
Fascinating topic.
There has to be some kind of regime change or a winner imposing something on a former perpetrator, as I can see, for these things to be dealt with in some way, and even then, not necessarily effectively. Stephen?
Yeah, I like those points there, Seb, and I like what you were saying towards the end, particularly there, where it's ongoing. And so maybe we're having a little German exchange here, but these long words of Vergangenheitsbewältigung and Vergangenheitsbearbeitung are quite different. And the first one is working through or overcoming the past, and that's been common in for many decades in Germany. And I really prefer the Bearbeitung term, where you're working through it, and a continual working through it, and that's part of it. It cannot be ignored. And what we see that very clearly in post-Second World War related to the Holocaust and Japan's involvement in the war. And Japan has not done a thorough job that Germany has. I really think that Germany is quite a good example of how to come out of something atrocious, even at that scale, which seems impossible. And I think, from what I've seen, they've done quite well with what you can do after a horrific onslaught on humans, on civilians. But Japan, there's been, even in the last decade, there's been attacks on Japanese embassies throughout Southeast Asia for when new textbooks came out that whitewashed the past and so on. That's a very stark difference, right? So people have a long memory, obviously, and I don't believe in getting over things. That we've been working through things, and I think we all integrate things into our lives that have not been optimal, maybe, right? We can't really get over them. They're part of who you are, and that's collectively and individually, right? So how do you integrate this horrific experience into your national and personal and community lives, right?
Mm-hmm.
I think that there's huge issues of national security that come to the fore here, where we have a place called the International Criminal Court. It's one building, it's in the Netherlands, and it's not a massive imposing threat on those people who wish to carry out genocide. Now, it's something. There is a building, there are people, there are lawyers who are working in this area, but it's so minuscule. If we take stock after 1948 and the UN Declaration and the implementation in 1951, we need a more robust collective security system that will actually be true to the declaration that we all signed on after the Second World War, and then where we consider genocide to be a crime that we need to intervene in, and then not turn our backs and say, well, that's a civil war, that's a local skirmish, and get out of it, right? That's because there's a lot of genocides that have taken place after the declaration of the UN. What that looks like, I talk to my students about this all the time. We have hope in the next generation to maybe change some of these things, but they need to be changed, and to work together. I think internationalizing, again, on the same point, internationalizing the problems are key. So we come at these types of atrocities and even approaches before they become the atrocities collectively as an international community, and address them. And finally, I would say, we need to spend a lot more time and resources on alternative methods of approaching and dealing with mass violence and conflict and genocide in our world. And so we have kind of one tool in the toolbox. It's like hammer and sort it out, see if we can sort it out that way. I mean, I just did talk about a robust collective security system, but doesn't necessarily have to be mass violence in response to these atrocities, right? So have we explored new ways of interacting that would, internationally, nationally, internationally, even in their communities, that is innovative? And we have those kind of peace building think tanks, and the thing is, we don't really, not a lot, right? So there's a lot of room there for innovation and new ways of approaching age-old problems.
Thank you. Last word to you, Larissa. We're past our end time, but I want to give you some time.
Sure. Thank you very much, Keith, and everyone. Couple of points. So you have spoken about admitting to cases of genocide, apologies being issued, even if it's 100 years later. But there's also a reverse process that's taken place in many jurisdictions. For instance, take Poland, country that suffered horrendously in the hands of the Nazis and the genocide and extermination of European Jewry. At the same time, recently in Poland, there have been reversal of some laws, and sort of certain subjects have been swept under the rug in terms of the collaboration of certain elements within Poland with Nazis. It's still a taboo. So unveiling those sort of facets of history that less known would be important, and educating the young people about different and difficult points in Native history of their country. And also, of course, you already spoke about sort of using globalization in a positive way, bringing young people to historical sites, to museums, to monuments, actually having time to pause and reflect what they're seeing and what they're hearing, and not making it just an educational tourism, but a deeper educational experience. And also encouraging the young generation, be curious, look into their family's personal history, because a lot may be there. And I may add one point that I actually thought of in the end in relation to Russia, making careers outside of security structures, albeit security is very important, internal and external, and there are appealing careers in police, in jurisdictional diplomacy, that's all valid. But in modern Russia, for instance, a career in the police force, in particular in Russia, in riot police force, is far more appealing than any arts degree that will bring you professional success these days. It's more prestigious, it's more stable, it's better paid, and it's a concerted effort on the part of the government to put forth those careers in front of the young people. Small comparison, maybe not necessarily very direct, comes to mind. Recruitment of young people from impoverished areas in the American South as recruits to the US Army throughout sort of later half of the 20th century, kind of exploiting that element that are seeking to be part of the bigger entity, right, beyond their little community or themselves for more better life. And so just putting different careers and opportunities in front of the people, being mindful of history.
Thank you. That's very, very thoughtful. Thank you. Well, I say we are past the time, and so I'm going to just wrap it up here, thanking all of our remaining guests. We still have a few who are in the weight room there, but most certainly thanking all of my colleagues here who came together and shared information that they've been researching, that they've been sharing in their classrooms, talking to students and colleagues about, and basically refining and finding ways to address what are incredibly complicated and troubling topics and conversations that are inevitably emotion-led, filled with emotion, that people get defensive, people get angry, people feel all of those emotions come forward when we speak about genocides. And so thank you for helping to lead us through some of those conversations today and giving us some ways to think about how we can go forward and generally help to make the world a better place. Thank you very much. Thank you, everybody. See you later.